As we speak, Donald Trump's calamitous global tariffs are devastating the stock market, triggering mass layoffs, increasing inflation, and will potentially plunge us into a recession. It's so bad that Trump, who typically loves to try to engage with the press and spew his typical bullshit, is running from them. He answered exactly one question about the tariffs, spewed a quick one-liner, and hopped a flight from Washington, D.C. to Mar-a-Lago. It's so bad that even Trump is running from the press. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, just to provide some context to the one question that Trump answered on the subject, again, before fleeing from Washington, D.C. to his private club, Mar-a-Lago, while the rest of us suffer as he puts the American economy on a path towards total disaster, you need to hear what is being reported about the current state of the markets because it's directly relevant.
And here's where things stand this hour amidst a global sell-off in response to the tariffs that the U.S. has imposed. The Dow down 1,300 points, or 3% right now. The NASDAQ down 5%, nearly 4% for the S&P. And by the way, it's the worst day for the NASDAQ since March of 2020. The Russell.
There you go. That's the key line. It's the worst since March of 2020 during the onslaught, the beginning of the COVID pandemic, which was also on Donald Trump's watch. It's the worst since the beginning of the recession that Trump presided over when he was president before, potentially presiding over a second one. Okay, with that in mind, Trump was asked about this before he hopped a flight from D.C. to Mar-a-Lago.
Trump, the markets today are way down, the worst day in years because of the tariffs. So how's it going?
I think it's going very well. It was an operation, like when a patient gets operated on. And it's a big thing. I said this would exactly be the way it is. We have $6 or $7 trillion coming into our country, and we've never seen anything like it. The markets are going to boom, the stock is going to boom, the country is going to boom, and the rest of the world wants to see, is there any way they can make a deal? They've taken advantage of us for many, many years. For many years, we've been at the wrong side of the ball, and I'll tell you what, I think it's going to be unbelievable.
So he finishes up, we'll play that in just a second, but again, I think everything's going great. I think the country's going to boom. Yeah, like an implosion sometimes creates a boom, perhaps. Here's the tail end of his answer to that question before he runs away from the press.
And the rest of the world wants to see, is there any way they can make a deal? They've taken advantage of us for many, many years. For many years, we've been at the wrong side of the ball, and I'll tell you what, I think it's going to be unbelievable. The thing that people have to talk about, we're up almost to $7 trillion of investment coming into our country, and you'll see how it's going to turn out. Our country's going to boom.
There you have it. Donald Trump is running from the press because things are so damn bad as a direct consequence of his disastrous policies. I will remind you as well that according to all the polling we have on this, the American people, and of course this polling predates the implementation, I should say, of this disastrous tariff schedule. The polling on this is terrible for Trump.
Caroline Levitt, the press secretary, called this the golden age that President Trump is ushering in here. Do voters feel that gold? With us now, CNN chief data analyst Harry Enton. Harry, the press secretary criticized the people she calls the naysayers when it comes to these tariffs. Who are the naysayers?
The naysayers are the majority of the American public. It's the American people who are the naysayers. Oppose new tariffs on other countries. All goods, look at this, 56% of Americans oppose new tariffs on all goods. How about cars in particular? 56% of Americans oppose new tariffs on imported cars and car parts. Look, the bottom line is the American people oppose. No, no, no. They do not want new tariffs. I looked at a ton of polling. It's really hard to find any in which you find folks supporting new tariffs, maybe against China, but against all our other countries, especially our allies, no, no, no. Oppose.
So again, these polls predate what Donald Trump just announced yesterday and what we're seeing the consequences of today. The conservative National Review is also not happy, and they have a devastating op-ed from their editors called Americans Will Pay the Price for Reckless Tariffs. Believing that a country is in bad shape if it imports more goods than it exports, i.e., if it has a trade deficit, is, in most cases, a harmless error in reasoning. It's the sort of thing that seems to make sense at first glance, but any halfway decent economics professor can train it out of students in 1 or 2 lectures. That error in reasoning becomes harmful when the person who believes it is the President of the United States, and he's willing to claim emergency powers to act on it unilaterally. That's what Donald Trump has done with his executive order to raise tariffs on virtually every country on Earth. As a share of the economy, the executive order is likely the largest peacetime tax increase in American history, which we discussed in a previous episode, a previous video. That is indeed an increasingly common sentiment among conservative analysts and Republicans, including Mike Pence, Trump's own former VP. In nominal terms, it's the largest tax increase, period. And it comes without any input from Congress. In fact, it effectively overturns the USMCA, CAFTA-DR, and the 12 bilateral free trade agreements that Congress has approved. On Tuesday morning, the Dow Jones Industrial Average opened down over 1,100 points, or about 2.6%, in reaction to the news, while the tech-heavy NASDAQ collapsed around 800 points, or 4.6%. Trump claims extraordinary powers to impose the tariffs on the basis that the trade deficit is a national emergency. He claims to be helping with manufacturing firms, but groups such as the National Association of Manufacturers oppose the tariffs, probably because about half of U.S. imports are imports for domestic production. Even Joe Biden, under intense pressure from his progressive supporters, did not declare a national emergency for climate change. There's about as much evidence that climate change is a national emergency as there is that the trade deficit is one, so expect the next Democratic president to waltz through the door that Trump has opened. Speaking of old wrong Democrats, Dick Gephardt in his wildest dreams probably would have never imagined the protectionist spree Trump has wrought. The White House claims to have calculated, quote, tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers, end quote, for nearly every country. These numbers are in far excess of the tariffs that countries impose on U.S. goods, because the formula used to calculate them has nothing to do with tariffs. Instead, it is the trade deficit divided by the amount of imports. The tariffs levied are either 10% or half of that trade deficit ratio, whichever is higher. If the U.S. has a trade surplus with a country, and the U.S. has a trade surplus with over 100 countries, it is set at 10% automatically. In effect, it is a 10% minimum tariff for all imports, with many top U.S. trade partners facing much higher rates. There's no consideration given to alliances. Taiwanese goods are taxed at 32%, South Korean goods at 25%, and Japanese goods at 24%. Venezuelan goods, on the other hand, are only taxed at 15%, and Iranian goods face the bare minimum 10%. The U.S. has a trade surplus with Iran in large part because they face economic sanctions due to their malign behavior, and so we do very little business with them. Take a country like Costa Rica, for example. The U.S. goods trade deficit with Costa Rica amounts to less than 0.2% of the total U.S. goods trade deficit, so even if you think trade deficits are bad, it's basically irrelevant. Some of the top imports from Costa Rica include products such as bananas and coffee, which are hardly grown at all in the U.S. because of geography. But now, because of Trump, Americans will be taxed at 10% for buying Costa Rican bananas and coffee. Perhaps the most galling is the 17% tax rate levied on Israeli goods. Israel is party to the longest-running U.S. bilateral free trade agreement in effect since 1985. There were almost no Israeli tariffs on U.S. goods to begin with, but as a gesture of goodwill earlier this week, the Knesset abolished the few remaining tariffs. The only reciprocal response would have been for the U.S. to eliminate all tariffs on Israeli goods. But Trump's policy was never about reciprocity. It was about his sincere and mistaken belief that tariffs are good. If trade deficits were inherently bad, we'd expect poor countries to have trade deficits and rich countries to have trade surpluses. In the real world, there's basically no relationship, which is why economists don't pay much attention to it. The United Kingdom, Japan, Egypt, and Uganda have trade deficits. Australia, the Netherlands, Russia, and Angola have trade surpluses. Even if it were true that the trade deficit is bad, higher tariffs won't necessarily reduce it. They reduce the amount of imports, but they also reduce the amount of exports as companies shift their focus from abroad to the protected home market. The order says that if the trade deficit isn't reduced, the president can continue to raise tariffs until he's satisfied. No specific target is named. The last thing that worked to substantially reduce the U.S. trade deficit was the Great Recession, because a bunch of people lost their jobs and couldn't afford to buy as much stuff as normal. You probably remember that as a bad time. But if trade deficits are truly national emergency level terrible, then the 2009 reduction in trade deficit should have been great news. Trump likes to frame his trade policy as common sense, to treat allies worse than enemies and raise taxes on consumers and businesses at a time when the cost of living is a major concern is anything but common sense. Trump's mistaken beliefs about trade have been a constant since the 1980s, but now they've been combined with an enormous grant of power, and Americans will pay the price. Again, that's from the conservative, Trump-supporting National Review. They're not happy about this. So, yeah, there you have it. Maybe on some level, Donald Trump recognizes that there's going to be blowback. He just hopes to weather it, and that's why he's hiding from the press. But there you have it. It's so bad that even Trump is doing everything in his power to avoid any sort of public-facing accountability for this, and he's going to Mar-a-Lago, to his gilded private club, as the most powerful man on earth to weather out the storm while the rest of us get soaked in it. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.